Good afternoon. My name is Victoria DiFrancesco Soto, and I am the Dean of the Clinton School of Public Service, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here today to the Clinton Presidential Center. I have been looking forward to this event for a very long time. To be precise, when I first got to meet Dr. Davis and he was telling me about this book project. So I'm over the moon about today's event, but I'm even happier because we have someone very, very special, not just to the state and someone who you'll read about in this book, but someone who is responsible for the fact there is a Clinton School of Public Service. For our founding Dean Emeritus, Senator David Pryor is with us here today. I thank you, Senator Pryor, for the foundational work you did for this school. We are approaching our 20th anniversary, and it is such an honor to be charting out the next 20 years on the foundation that you and Dean Emeritus Skip Rutherford built. I also wanted to give a very special welcome to Senator Mark Pryor, who is with us, as well as former State Senator Eddie Armstrong. Thank you for your public service. And to Dr. Michael Moore from the University of Arkansas System and Ms. Melissa Rust, who have been stalwart advocates and supporters of the Clinton School. So thank you for being here. Thank you all today for being here. Dr. Davis, like myself, is a political scientist. So we get together and we nerd out. And I'm not gonna nerd out because I'm not gonna go there. But this work, I'm gonna show it up here. Each of you need to get this in the bookstore, is undoubtedly a crucial contribution to the scholarship and the literature of political science and the social sciences, right? But beyond the important scholarly contribution that Dr. Davis puts forward, he is able to help us as Arkansans, and now I'm an official Arkansan, to pause and unpack all of the rapid movement we saw within a very short course of time. From Blue to Red offers a fascinating look at how Arkansas went from being one of the most solidly Democratic states to one of the most ardently Republican states in just a couple of years. This note here really blew my mind, how on the morning, election day of 2010, Democrats occupied 3 of the 4 Arkansas seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, both U.S. Senate seats, all state constitutional offices, and decisive majorities in both chambers of the Arkansas General Assembly. By the time votes were in, that was no longer the case, and that had really set the state on course to where we are today. Dr. Davis provides this rigorous shift, and this is going to be something that he's going to do in conversation with Dr. Jay Barth, another political scientist, and really looking at the historical context, because it's not just 2010, it's also understanding further back, going into the past several decades to understand how we charted this path that we are on today. Former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson called From Blue to Red the definitive book on the modern history of the Arkansas GOP. And I'm going to take just a minute to read this quote because I think it really captures the essence of this work. By researching and writing this history, Dr. Davis has critiqued the key ingredients for the rise of any political movement and then dramatically laid out the challenges of the future of Arkansas, of the Arkansas GOP. Dr. Davis writes in a way that both informs and inspires those interested in politics and then makes one think about the future and what it will bring. This book will be enjoyed and studied for generations into the future. I couldn't agree more. Dr. Davis currently serves as the executive director of the David and Barbara Pryor Center for Arkansas Oral and Visual History in the University of Arkansas's Fulbright College of Arts and Sciences. He's an associate professor of teaching, also at the Fulbright College, and perhaps most importantly of everything I've said, Dr. John Davis is an 8th generation Arkansan. And with that, I give you Dr. Jay Barth and Dr. John Davis.
Thank you, Vicki, and two other folks stuck in the room as you were speaking. Justice Barbara Webb snuck in, and Doyle Webb, the chair of the Republican Party, longtime chair of the Republican Party, who gets a lot of airtime in this book, as you'll hear a bit later. Welcome to you all, and John, congratulations. This is a great book, and very, very proud it's been added to the array of books on Arkansas politics, because it's much needed, and congratulations.
Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for the Clinton Library, the Clinton School. Thank you, Senators Pryor, for being with us, and everyone in the audience. I'm awestruck that y'all couldn't find anything else better to do in a lunch hour on Monday. But thank you, and really, in a lot of ways, the book is a very small way for me to give tribute to the wonderful journalism and the political science and history faculty we've had for decades, including Jay Barth here, who have consistently given top-notch scholarship and editorial effort to Arkansas politics, to a state that we call home, that we love, and kept us abreast of things in ways that a lot of smaller states really wouldn't be so self-aware. And so I hope it joins that collection of other wonderful pieces that have been around for decades.
Well, let's get to it. And Vicki really started this hinting at this about just how dramatic this change has been. And could you just talk a little bit about how exceptional, when we look at across the country in the modern era, just how abnormal, let's put it that way, has this dramatic change in partisanship in an individual state been?
So I think we can look at it, for several decades now, we use blue and red, and we do in the book title as well. And then there's, of course, purple. And typically what you would expect would be a state it's not unusual to have one party rule. It's really not. Voters oftentimes, for a litany of reasons we can speculate, it's not unusual to see a state that's more solidly Democratic or more solidly Republican. Arkansas was in an extraordinary league of states that, from the Reconstruction era to fairly recently, were stridently Democratic, right? And there's a whole history there of that. What was unique about Arkansas was we didn't have the slow reddening happen in this state that we saw in Alabama and Mississippi and others in Georgia. Texas. That was a slow burn, if you will. In political science, we use the term secular realignment, and it really fits that narrative. What we had in Arkansas, for reasons we can get to here later on, was almost a wall. I mean, almost a blue wall that went around the borders of Arkansas. And we consistently had policymakers and political talent that were consistently Democrats, that were, to use, a boxing analogy, punching above their weight, right? We consistently had lawmakers and policy leaders in this state that were not only influential in Arkansas, but abroad. And I think that's unique. I think then, to get to Jay's point, we didn't have the purple era. It never happened. As the dean mentioned, in 2010, you could wake up and, one day you had perhaps mathematically one of the most Democratic states. And by the time you woke up the next day and you're reading the paper, we were on the beginning of being one of the most ardently Republican. And Doyle Webb, I think, correctly said that around the time of was it the 16 convention, I think, where 16 or 20, where Mr. Webb was quoted as saying, we're one of the, if not the most Republican states in the country. And I think mathematically he was right at that point. That goes back to 2008, where Republicans couldn't find, candidates to run for office. Senator Mark Pryor right, had, I think, an independent, maybe a libertarian candidate. The Republican Party, he's a popular incumbent. The Republican Party couldn't get anybody to, to want to be cannon fodder, for lack of a better term. That shifted so quickly. I think it's the quickness, the rapidity of it, but also the completeness of it is what stands out. It's not the one party rule. It's the seemingly overnight change that we saw, and we all witnessed it.
Yeah. So, John, political scientists make choices about how they're going to study a topic, and some folks veer in a more quantitative direction, others in a more historical direction. You took a different approach here, and could you talk some about the methods you undertook in carrying out this story?
Sure. So real quickly, and I would be remiss if I didn't say this, I didn't actually work for the Pryor Center when I started the book. But I owe so much of the qualitative, the interview aspect of the book to the Pryor Center. My predecessor, Bill Schwab, called me one day. I was getting ready to leave. I was sneaking out of my office at UAM a little early, and I had some running shoes on, and it was a day like this, and I get a phone call, and I almost didn't answer. I thought, well, I'll call. I don't know who it is. I'll call him back. Luckily, I took the call, and Bill Schwab asked me to begin an oral history project at the Pryor Center. And so really without that, I don't know that the book would have happened. And if it did, I don't think it would have had that sort of quality, that qualitative bent to it, because political scientists were largely data-driven, quantitative animals anymore overall. And so it was wonderful to be able to mix some of that analytical aspects of Arkansas politics, and then I hope really enriching the story and contextualize the story by talking to reporters, academics, and elected officials, not such as yourself. I also tried to break it up. When I teach political parties, I'll usually argue with the students that there's basically three parts of a party. And I give due credit to many other political scientists before me that came up with this idea. V.O. Keyes credited, I think there's a few others that can claim this as well, where they see the political party as three parts. They've got the party in the electorate, the party in government, and the party as an organization. And it helps me to conceptualize what a party is when I can break it down those three ways. And so the book's largely organized in that. And then further, I argue in the book that there's effectively three generations. So that gets to the historical aspect of this. The further I went along in this project, I found that there were three waves, if you will, of the GOP. And so you can go to 66, 68 with Rockefeller and Hammerschmidt. And we still talk about them because of the impacts they had in policy and public service, but really also because they were an anomaly. This was highly unusual, peculiar territory that Arkansas was finding itself in. And then we really didn't see that party grow. They didn't have the coattails politically that we might anticipate. Rockefeller's party in many ways moves away from him nationally and regionally while he's in office. And then John Paul Hammerschmidt builds a wonderful congressional career. It's celebrated by members of both parties, but he was sort of cut off in that region of the state. And then you get into the second generation where now the party's competitive. The party can compete against open seat elections. Jim Rankino at one point said that Republicans can win when Democrats screw up. When there's a misstep strategically. You don't see it until later in November and you go, golly, we gave that one to them. Republicans were equipped to do that. They could compete. They could step into a vacancy, a special election, a Mike Huckabee scenario, but still not the dominating party by any means, and still struggling very much on almost every metric we would look at. To the third generation today, where we have a lot of elected officials who are in the state capitol who are Republicans who, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but they don't know what it's like to lose. They've never done that. Asa Hutchinson and a few other members in the legislature still remember what it's like to sign up knowing you're probably going to get stomped, but you need to run to help your party the next cycle or to just keep names on the ballots. This generation's more like the Democrats in that regard, say 20, 30 years ago. If you're a young college student right now and you're ambitious, you're probably thinking, well, if I enter politics in Arkansas, partisan politics, I'm going to have to do it as a Republican. 20 years ago, it would have been the other way around. You would have said, I need to figure out, I don't know if I'm a Democrat, but if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to run and, If I'm going to run for office as a partisan in most parts of the state, 20, 30 years ago, the smart money would be to be a Democrat. And that's that dramatic shift. Now, I tried to capture all that in a 140-page book. I didn't. It really isn't that big, that long.
Yeah, but it's got some great quotes in it, and that's what I think is really so rich about this book. And those interviews, how many did? About 20?
There were 19 total. I didn't use all of them as far as quotes in the book, but really, and I try to give everybody credit in there, all 19, because all 19 built upon the way that I saw the project as it continued. I had this in a desk drawer a year or two before I'd gotten a call. And I remember struggling, who do you talk to? How do you get this figured out? And I wouldn't have had the resources, and I wouldn't have had the otherwise support had it not been for the Pryor Center. And that's what got us to the 19 interviews.
So let's do a deep dive into this third generation, this period of dominance by the Republican Party, and I want to talk through all three of those components: the electorate, the party as an organization, and the party in government. And let's start with the Arkansas electorate. And you make the case that it has changed in some important ways. And could you talk through those changes in the Arkansas electorate, especially in this last period where most of us have really seen this dramatic change?
So again, to give credit to wonderful scholarship, the University of Arkansas poll, if you're not familiar with it, it's just an incredibly valuable resource that we have in Arkansas. It's a nonprofit university poll, so they're going to ask a lot of the same questions every year, which us political types love, because you can actually look at trends that way. Janine Perry, who's a colleague and mentor of mine, has been running that poll for over 2 decades now. And we can see it there. There's some wonderful stories in the book and wonderful quotes about this shift and people grappling with what they're seeing in real time. But the poll might be the most illustrative for our context, where you see a shift over time. If you're looking year-to-year comparisons of who's identifying as a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, you can see it move. You can see the plural, the maybe not the majority, but the plurality of people shifting over to the independent ranks. And it's pretty quick. I mean, it really is. And it's not so much that Republicans gained, they did over a 20-year period, they almost double in some of those polls, but it's a slow gain. The bigger shift occurs away from the Democratic Party, right? So it's not so much that maybe these voters are identifying as Republicans yet, because voters are stubborn, right? We want to latch on to a label and hold it, even if our behavior might not suggest the same. And so I think we see that, and that's not terribly unique. What's unique, though, is that 20-year span, if you have columns where, say you could color code it, you had, red and blue and green or whatever for independent, you see a move away from blue, you see a gain in the red column, and then just a sea of green, right? A lot of people identifying as independents. And we know that a lot of independents really aren't independent. So when they say they're independent, we can do follow-up questions. And a lot of times oddly enough, we'll find out that majorities of them, in many cases, will actually be more partisan than some of the initial partisans. And what I mean is, in the last 3 elections, who have you voted for? Oh, all Republicans. But you're an independent? Yeah, I'm an independent. Oh, okay. Or Democrats, same sort of thing. And so there's a lot of that going on, a lot of movement there. But it's slow and fast at the same time, if that makes sense, right? There's a consistent trend favoring Republicans for quite a while, but we don't see the effects until 1 or 2 election cycles. And once that locks in, once all the pieces are in place for that to happen, it happens overnight, seemingly. So
there's this court case that a lot of Republicans know a lot about, but a lot of Arkansans have probably never heard of, and it's Republican Party of Arkansas versus Faulkner County. It's this 1995 court case that actually had some pretty big ramifications for how the electorate behaved. Could you just talk a little bit about that case that you spent some time on in the book? Sure.
So there's this court case, and really it's regarding an electoral practice that many of us, if we witnessed it, didn't think anything of it. For decades, for a very, very long time, party primaries in Arkansas have been conducted, but they've been funded by the parties. And so a party that is perennially favored, that has quite a bit of money from filing fees from candidates who want to run under that label. I'm thinking Democrats over most of the 20th century were flush with cash. And so the electioneering aspects, the actual having a ballot box, manning the table, right, paying for that person, and that was a huge advantage to Democrats. Democrats could have several of these precinct locations that would kind of mirror what we see today, right? Now, tomorrow with the primary, we can go to our relatively local neighborhood precinct. Well, you had that if you were voting in the Democratic primary. What you didn't probably know is the party had to fund it. And that was also why you couldn't find a Republican ballot. Republicans had such a hard time gaining traction in certain parts of the state that they didn't have any candidates running in those areas. They couldn't draw the necessary funds, the filing fee money to conduct these elections at the poll place. So the example that came to light in that court case was, I believe it was Arkansas County, had one GOP precinct, it was claimed, and I think that was in as recent as 1992 when this case was working its way through the court system. So another fun story about this is it's Asa Hutchinson, who is the party chairman at the time, and he argues on First and 14th Amendment grounds that this is unconstitutional. It's just patently unfair to Arkansas voters, particularly Republican Arkansas voters. They're effectively denied their ability to participate in their party's primary process. So once the Court of Appeals rules in favor of the GOP, pretty quickly the state legislature moves ahead. There's a bill sponsored to rectify this issue. And Governor Hutchinson told me that the person who was one of the most stalwart supporters of reform in this was Mike Beebe, of all people, who at the time was a senator, well-known senator from Searcy. Of course, years later they would compete in 2006, and then Senator Beebe would become Governor Beebe. But that's one of those. It's not that long ago. I mean, 1995. So before then, 94, 92, 90, Republicans were struggling so that they didn't even have voting locations that were mathematically in line with what Democrats had in the state. That's a huge advantage. That's a generational sort of thing, right? It's hard to grow up as a Republican in Arkansas when there's no Republicans that can be elected in your county. So that was I don't know if it was an intentional thing. Some of it, I think, was almost just historical. It was an
intentional thing, John.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was historical practice that certainly helped the majority party, right? I don't think any majority party is going to look at that and say, well, that's unfair to these folks we're competing with. Maybe we should level the playing field. That wasn't going to happen. So it took a court case.
Yeah. And now folks who already had Republican sentiments, they could just go to the same polling place and cast a vote that day just as easily as their Democratic neighbors. So let's talk about parties as an organization. And historically, Arkansas was kind of known. VOK described Arkansas as a no-party state. So you can talk about that a little bit, but talk about how there now is a political party in Arkansas, and it's a much more sophisticated political party, the Republican Party. Talk through how we've seen change in that second aspect of partisanship.
So a lot of times when we think about a party, we may have an idea of almost like a party machine, right? There's this group of people, and there's all these machinations going on behind the scenes, and that really wasn't, in the way that we would typically see it, it wasn't happening in Arkansas for so long. Diane Blair and others have commented on this too, that Democrats were so ubiquitous and so dominating that it was more about personality or trust with that candidate, right? So Senators Pryor here, David and Mark, right, would have personal connections with people. And it was less about ideology and policy, really, and more about relationships. And you can do that in a state that, now we have a little over 3 million people. You could almost, in a political career, meet almost everybody that's over 18. It's a voting age, in theory, over time. And that was something that I think aided in this sort of lack of professionalization when it comes to a central state party on both sides. The Democrats didn't really have a need for it in the way that maybe we would expect more competitive states to have this. And then the Republicans just didn't have the resources, right? And I was in grad school with a good friend, Drew Kurlowski, who's now at Coastal Carolina, and we did a survey of all party organizations, state party organizations in the country, and very few people answered our survey, sadly. In grad school students, they didn't care. But Arkansas did, to their credit. Both parties did. And they had previously answered a survey that was asked very similar questions in 99. And so that gave us about a 15-year appraisal of where they were right in 99, 2000, and where they were around 14, 15. And what we saw there was a Republican Party that had completely transformed organizationally. They're all the metrics, the fundraising, canvassing, working with county leaders, right, to build sort of a grassroots machine. And I don't mean machine in a derogatory sense, but like something that's going to be ready to roll every 2 years. It doesn't have to be rebuilt all the time. And all that happens really about the time that Doyle Webb is named the leader of the party apparatus here in Little Rock. And not to put Mr. Webb on the spot, but I think there was a real push for professionalization and making that's a full-time role. The Democrats are now, I would argue, and you see it in the survey, in the 14-15 survey, they're catching up. But for so long, they just didn't need to do that. That wasn't something they were worried about. And articulating a particular brand of liberal democratic national message wasn't very appealing to voters in Arkansas anyway. And so it's a harder dance to make, I think, for Democrats, and has been for quite a while. The Republican Party today probably mirrors any high-performing organization that you would see in the U.S. It's still not, we're still not a overtly party-centered, orientated politics, I don't think. But certainly the Republican brand, I think, aligns better with a lot of moderate to conservative voters in Arkansas. And so that party apparatus reflects that success.
So the third aspect is this role of party in government. And now, of course, we have Republican Party dominance in state government. And let's talk through the way in which that matters or doesn't matter. But I think you make the case it matters a fair amount. So get started with that. How does it matter, and how has it played out?
So you and I had a phone call one day. I don't know if you remember this. This was in 15 or 16, I think it was 16 or 17. It was 17. It was a legislative session. And I'm walking around the state capitol. My former institution, UAM, I was a professor of political science and director of governmental relations. And I was, in the rotunda doing what you do during the session meeting with legislators. And I remember talking to you and actually trying to get onto you because I love the Arkansas Politics book. That was the second edition, I think, in 05. And we were talking about you're working on the third. And I remember at some point you asked me a question about, will the policy change? And I don't know why I said it, but I was convinced that day. I said, I think it will a little bit, but not much, right? I think, voters, it's not like all of the Arkansas voters move somewhere else and they've been replaced. It's not as if those who are politically ambitious, and seeking an office are all new to Arkansas. So I really didn't think it would change in such a measure of ways that it has. And Jay was, I think you said, well, very nicely, I think you said, well, that's nonsense. But I think you were a little nicer than that. There was noise in the rotunda. You might have said it something harshly and I just didn't hear it. But I think, the question was, how does an electorate that our voter turnout is not where it needs to be as a state, never has. There's not a new pool of voters there, really. It's generational, effects and stuff, and new people are in the rolls and participating. But I think there's a real mystery there, and I don't do a great job of explaining it other than you're electing more consistently. And I think we're even changing what the word conservative means. And I mean that it's sort of, I think it's a fluid term right now. But we have a Republican Party that is very much in line with its voters, very much in line with its brand, its candidates, from the national level down to Arkansas. I think there's almost a perfect alignment and match. And the Democrats, on the other hand, have never really had that. Certainly not since the 60s or 70s. You had a party that was, I would argue, more socially liberal, progressive on a great many things, even economically. And we had leadership in Arkansas that was more moderate, and maybe personally they were more progressive, but they were trying to represent, I think, a more moderate to conservative base. And with elected officials in here, I feel kind of silly saying this, so if I'm wrong, I apologize. But that's the feeling I get. I think now the push is, to be more stridently conservative, right? To be more stridently Republican. And I don't think we had that ideological factor when we had majority Democrats in leadership. And that leads to voter confusion and a whole mess of things. I think right now with Republicanism, you've got a Republican dominance. You've got a pretty just top-down approach. And there is a push. I've talked to legislators that take pride in increasing the rankings from interest groups, right, to be more conservative on issues, no matter if it's social, economic. Part of it's the nationalization of politics. I think there's just more awareness of something that happens, why does this group that's based out of Spokane, Washington care about, our vote in Little Rock? Well, they can put it on Twitter, X, sorry. They can put it on X. They can put it on Facebook. They can put it on blogs, on podcasts. They can put you on blast, right? And really reward and recognize you or punish you. And I think that's a whole new thing. We really didn't see that 20, 30 years ago. And so I think the effect has been a much more conservative or pure, I guess a more ideologically pure, more partisan, pure type of politics today than we've seen in a very long time in Arkansas.
Although we do have, some hints of factionalism within the Republican Party. Yeah. And, factionalism really goes back. We've always been a one-party state. It's a different party. But factionalism has been a kind of a grand tradition in Arkansas going back to the beginning. And so could you talk a little bit about the factionalism that does exist in today's Republican Party? And does that have potential ramifications for the long-term health of the party? Or is it just simply a division that is going to be dealt with in primary elections?
I think politics is such a competitive, adversarial thing that this is sort of inevitable, but we had a long history, as you just mentioned, Jay, of Democrats running against Democrats in primaries, right? And, the model might be an incumbent who's pretty well known, pretty well liked, and then you've got this, young, kind of ambitious, I don't want to wait on this person to retire, I'm going to seize the moment. And that was the kind of Democratic infighting that at least we saw publicly, right? There's personalities and people that weren't liked and all that, but the electorate didn't necessarily see that. The electorate would see, do we want, the standard bearer, kind of consistent, we know what we're getting here, or are we ready for something new? I don't think a lot of discussions were about ideology. I don't recall old campaign ads of such, someone saying McClellan is too liberal for Arkansas or something like that. You just didn't see it. They were competing against one another, and they had different ideas and values and personalities. But that was what we saw with the Democrats. The Republicans, I think right now we're seeing, because it's adversarial, it's just a competitive entity, right? Instead of competing necessarily against Democrats right now, your real risk as a Republican is getting sort of outflanked on your right in most districts in Arkansas. If I'm a Republican incumbent, and I feel for people who feel, sort of trapped in this, where they feel like I'm representing these folks right here, and we're more conservative, and here are my issues and my values, and they line up really well with my electorate or most folks there. But the concern is there's always somebody who can say, well, you're not Republican enough or conservative enough. Your credentials are not strong enough. And so I think that leads to public policy changes as well. And I think we've seen some of that, where I think the risk that you run as a Republican today is pushing so far over that in a more ideologically focused environment, that your voters might one day feel like you're not really representing their values and views, right? You can have a conservative, moderate to conservative district, but perhaps you could get a little too far over. Now, on the other hand, the question is, are those voters inclined to vote for a Democrat instead? And I don't think we're there, right? I think we're in a political world right now, and this goes for both parties, where we don't necessarily vote for the candidate, we vote against the other candidate. And so I think that's a risk for Republicans right now, is pushing to maybe focusing on national issues that aren't necessarily as important to Arkansans. And I'm not saying we're there yet, but I could see that. Because again, the competition is going to come from the right. It's not going to come right now from the Democrats. There's a handful of competitive House races that'll be on the ballot in November, but there aren't that many. Most of the contests are going to be settled tomorrow.
So we got some questions emailed in, and one does relate to partisan change in the government. Kind of relates to a variety of topics, actually, but and it's about term limits. And Arkansas, obviously, in the 1990s, implemented the most dramatic term limits law in the nation. It's been softened a bit over time. But how much do term limits matter in setting the stage for this kind of dramatic partisan change, or was it kind of disconnected?
So I think it mattered. I mean, I think it created open seat elections. And by the 1990s into the 2000s, particularly in the early 2000s, you started to see Republican or voters who had voted for Republican presidents for some time start to sort of dabble in voting for Republicans down ticket. And if they knew the Democratic incumbent and there was a rapport there, then they'd probably continue to vote for him or her, right? We were in that era. So you saw a lot of, I mean, I grew up in Batesville, but my more formative years were in Hot Springs. So we had Mike Ross, right, as our U.S. congressman. Jay Dickey before, but most of my time in Hot Springs, it was Ross. And I think Congressman Ross was really good at relating to people, working really hard on doing all the things, all the field work that we want to see out of our constituency service work. We want to see out of members of Congress. And that's an Arkansas tradition in a lot of ways. And I think that worked until you had an open seat. And then that voter was faced with two unknowns, and they knew, right? A lot of these voters are thinking, I really do line up more with the Republican in this race. Or I've got an idea of what a Democrat is if it's not the one I know and trust, and it's not positive, right? It's a net negative. So that I had to have had an effect. And that's from term limits, right? Term limits would effectively end a political career. Now, in some ways, it may have backfired momentarily because you had people like Mike Beebe, and I don't know if it's true or not, but he would always say, well, I would still be a state senator from Searcy if it weren't for term limits. Maybe. I think he wanted to be governor. But, to that effect, right, this forces House members to move to the Senate and Senate to then move up maybe to constitutional office in Arkansas. And in a way, in the short run, that may have backfired a little bit on Republicans who were trying to run for some of those positions. But I think it would be hard to say that term limits had no effect in this. It created that era where you had more competition, more open seats where, candidate A and candidate B, Democrat and Republican, were not known. And so then you're looking at the national issues and you're looking at social issues and you're saying, I don't know that I don't know these people, so I'm going to default to maybe the more generic candidate that I align with or think I do. And that in many cases was a Republican. In a lot of rural, especially places where I'm, have more roots, it's a more rural conservatism that didn't align well with Democratic national politics.
So John, several of the questions we got via email from folks who are here really are about the future and what to expect in the future. And I think one question is, we've seen a lot of change in a very brief period of time. To what degree is there a possibility of a very different kind of change in a more democratic direction in the next 10 years?
Predictions are tricky. I always feel more confident I'm looking at something that's already happened and I explain it. I think, and this came up in a lot of the interviews that I was able to collect, and I really greatly appreciated the insights from these folks because they had different backgrounds, different experiences and perspectives. But I think the long and short of it was there seemed to be a consensus, and I tend to agree that in the next 10 years, we're going to continue to see, what we're seeing today, by and large. I think it was Hal Holbrook who was quoted saying that Arkansas is always, 30 years behind or something like that. So if the world ends, you want to be in Arkansas because you'll get another 30 years. There's something to that. In some ways, our demographics. So now I'm in Northwest Arkansas where it's booming and there's a lot of growth and there's a great deal of diversity that wasn't there 30, 40 years ago. They're growing Marshallese, Latino communities, and a lot of people moving in that aren't from here, right? That may look like me. I mean, they may be, kind of generic white guys, but they're from Chicago or they're from, California or something. They're going to come in with different perspectives and views too. But by and large, Arkansas is still a smaller, quite rural state. that is more moderate to conservative. And I don't see that changing in 10 years. I don't see the national political dynamics, and I mean, they're changing. There's a lot going on right now. But I just, in my instincts tell me that we won't see a real change in the next decade here. I think the real question is generationally. What will we see the next generation? I break the book into 3 generations of the GOP. Yep. What's the next generation of the GOP and the next generation for Democrats look like? If I have friends on both sides of the political spectrum, and my Democratic activist friends don't like my book as much, it's not a very rosy picture for them. But they could, and not saying I've got it figured out, but I think there is a story there of how a party builds and in some ways starts over and figures out a way to relate and maybe has to admit that, okay, it wasn't working. It worked so well for so long, and it's really hard to put that playbook down. But what do we need to do for just a moment to rethink how we're moving forward? I think Democrats are doing that in Arkansas. And I think Republicans right now they've learned how to govern by and large. There's I think it was John Brumman, who I quote in the book, who heard Republican legislators, right as they gain really sizable majorities, and they're talking to Governor Hutchinson, and I think that's right. I think Governor Hutchinson says, we've got to show them, meaning us, Arkansans, we Republicans can govern. And I think they figured that out. And so now the next step for them is prolonging this wave, right? This tidal wave of Republican success. It will eventually slow. They can only win so many seats. And then how do they handle the governing at that point? They've went through one redistricting process. What's it look like down the road? How do they handle the personality shifts and quirks? Republicans are just now getting to the point where they have impatient, younger, politically ambitious people who are wanting to run for office, and they don't want to wait on Senator, such and such to retire, so I'm going to go run against him now. How does the party handle that? These are things that Democrats did quite artfully for a long time, and now I'm eager to see how Republicans handle it. But at 10 years, I think we see much the same. I have no idea what it looks like beyond that, but I think there's challenges for both parties. The one thing I will say is I think the temptation is to look at the numbers and say that the Democratic Party now looks like the Republican Party in the 70s as far as their advantage or disadvantages. And I would argue it's worse. I would argue that it's a lot worse for Democrats today in a lot of areas, because back then it wasn't so ideological, and you already had ticket splitting. You already had voters flirting with the idea of voting for more Republicans. They're already, we voted for Nixon or Reagan, and, okay, we'll keep our Democratic incumbents. We like them. But once those incumbents are gone, right, then they started going Republican. I don't see that environment here. I don't see an open race contest for, say, a Senate contest, maybe a statewide race where you've got an open seat, no incumbent. I don't see a Democratic candidate winning those contests, or even being close right now. And so I would argue that we're in a different place right now. I don't think the 70s GOP gives the Democrats of today a great roadmap, but I think the longer version of it, I think if you're a Democrat, or you just like two-party systems, you just want to have two competitive parties. I'm a firm believer that two parties makes more effective representative public policy. And a lot of Republicans believe that too, and said as much in the 70s and 80s and 90s in this state. If we want to get back to that, right, and I think that's the thing that I'm most concerned about, is we want to have that balance. We need two viable parties. And right now, I don't see two equally viable parties.
Which is, of course, when we think back to what the Rockefeller,
exactly.
That's what he talked about, was the importance of a healthy two-party system, really leading to a better kind of governance.
Right.
That was the roots there. So you're living in Northwest Arkansas. I think a lot of folks recognize that if dramatic change is going to come in Arkansas's politics, it's going to come out of Northwest Arkansas, just because of the growth of that region. Could you talk a little bit about that more? You've hinted at it already, but could you kind of go a little deeper and how that change actually turns into something that's a partisan transformation?
So I think, working for the idea of change is the demographics, just the traffic coming into Northwest Arkansas. I had someone who's a demographer about a year ago say there are more people in Northwest Arkansas who are not from Northwest Arkansas than are from Northwest Arkansas, which is a pretty staggering thing for an Arkansan to think of. So there's going to be change. We don't know exactly where that goes. I think we're starting to see that. We're starting to see families that are maybe in their second generation of being an Arkansan, or maybe even being U.S. citizens, who are starting to involve themselves more in their local politics. And it's at the grassroots level. I mean, very, very much, town, city council, that kind of thing, JP races. And we're seeing a few competitive areas. And the funny thing is, right, historically, Northwest Arkansas was the place where Republicans had some stronghold. And we're seeing now, if there's a bright spot for Democrats, it's in that region. And a lot of it is people, a new electorate that is not accustomed, or maybe even in line with some of the same thoughts or value systems maybe as other Arkansans. No better or no worse, just different. And so I think we're seeing some of this, and I think Republicans are aware of it. I think when we saw redistricting this last time, we saw districts, that were drawn up in such a way in Northwest Arkansas to either sort of box in a Democratic incumbent, where Republican votes could, kind of get scraped into other districts to make sure those are safe. Or we saw in at least one case in a Springdale area where the district was basically just broken up. Democrats did this for a long time too, right? This is the way it is. This is the way it works, and this is the way a majority party stays a majority party. Is they try to hem up their opponents as much as they can. And it was telling to me that the Republicans were aware, right? If you look at the districts that changed the most, and not just because they were losing population, which happened sadly in my neck of the woods in Southeast Arkansas more recently. But if you look at Northwest Arkansas, the story was more about trying to carve out areas for strategic purpose, right? Republicans holding on to their lead, maintaining that lead. So they know that's where change will come if it comes. I feel the same way. I don't know when or if it happens. I think we would be misguided to assume that every new person coming into Northwest Arkansas is going to look at our politics and say, oh, I don't like this. There's a reason why they moved there, right? And so there's a lot of folks who moved in and feel right at home with Republican-dominated politics, and they're fine with that, right? They may want to help it grow. On the other hand, you may have folks who come from another state that, they find this, shocking, and they want to get involved. And so I think, again, it's one of those it depends kind of things. If it happens, though, if we see Arkansas become more competitive, it's going to come out of gains made by Democrats in Northwest Arkansas.
So you've done this great book, and thank you for doing it. Where do you go next? What are your questions as you think about the gifts of the Pryor Center in terms of telling the story of Arkansans of all types? Mm-hmm. What story, what kind of projects does that kind of invigorate in you thinking about the future?
So, there's a few things just because I feel like I have to. The Pryor Center, everything we do is on our website, including all these 19 interviews. They're transcribed. 18 of the 19 are videotaped. I still need to apologize to Attorney General Griffin. The camera turned off on him. So he's got the tape. He was lieutenant governor at the time. But we've got a collection of those. But we don't just do politics, right? The Pryor name is synonymous with Arkansas politics. But we really focus on just people and communities in the states. We have this vast archive, and I'd just be remiss if I didn't brag about that a little bit. And would love for you to go to our website or ask me questions, and I can show you around the website. But I'm a political scientist, so when I take my Pryor Center hat off for a minute and I pop on my faculty hat, and I'm a political scientist who's wanting to write and research and learn more about these things, there's two that come to mind. One, there were these flashpoint elections. And I hesitate to always point to elections and say, that's when it happened. But there were some that I think are just they're exemplars of kind of the points we're trying to get at, or I was trying to get at in the book. And a lot of them are mentioned in there. And there were a few I just really had not appropriately placed value on that once the book was finished, I went back and I thought that was a huge election. The 1993 special election, huge. Huge for the future of the state's politics.
Just talk a little bit, just 2 seconds about that. This is a special election for lieutenant governor.
Yeah, 1993, Mike Huckabee becomes lieutenant governor, right? He runs against Nate Coulter, very low turnout, special election. Everybody's kind of tired of politics. Everybody's excited. Clinton's going to the White House. The bench, so to speak, is kind of emptying a little bit, right? You've got a lot of young talent going to DC with the Clinton administration. And so you've got this vacuum. And as I tell students, power doesn't just go away. It's going to go somewhere. And the story is Asa Hutchinson goes to Mike Huckabee, who's in the hospital for exhaustion and pneumonia, and says, "Hey, you ran a great race. I need you to run again." And imagine you just completed a marathon and someone comes over to you and says, "Hey, buddy, great job. Listen, we got another one of these tomorrow morning." But it worked. It was a low turnout race. Mike Huckabee had run a really hard fought candidacy against a very popular incumbent in Bumpers, Senator Dale Bumpers, re-election. Huckabee loses, but actually gets more votes out of any Republican in the state at that time, during that cycle. So he's a natural fit for this seat. And not to take away from, but kind of sneaks in. I mean, people really don't expect him to win. The lieutenant governor position in Arkansas also is not a very powerful position by constitutional. It's just the way it's designed. And so even then, it took a series of things, right, and circumstances to unfold for him to then become governor in '96. And we have at least one member of his administration, Rex Nelson, here, who has some wonderful stories about that in our Pryor Center archives, as well as in the book, where Huckabee comes into this position as again, strong, ardently Democratic state, but he's a Republican who wins a special election, and then due to very unexpected circumstances, resignation of a governor, becomes governor, and then goes on to have over 10 really successful political years as governor. So those things, I think it would be neat to have a project where maybe every chapter breaks down some of these elections. The other one is I would love to collect oral histories about just civic life in Arkansas. I want to know why people don't vote or why they vote. And I would love to hear their stories. We can do polling all day, and polling is incredibly valuable to what we do and how we understand people and the way government works. And it's not to take away from that, but I love the richness of stories. And you don't get that with polls. And so if I could figure out a way, that's a long-term plan. I would love to, I'll keep a tape recorder in my car when I travel around, and I'd love to just talk to people, and come up with a battery of questions. Do you vote? Okay, well, not judging you if you don't. Why don't you? And we try to figure out why that is, and not try to necessarily preach to them, but I would like to have a picture of civic engagement in the state. That's a pet project of mine. More of us need to participate, and that's good for both parties. We need, that's good for our politics. It's good for our civic culture. And so that's another thing that came out of this in a lot of ways, is people that had sort of movement campaigns. Rockefeller found ways to get people to participate and be mobilized who might not normally be mobilized, or made people think a little differently, and their engagement changed. It altered some aspect of Arkansas politics at that time, and in some cases, the history of the state.
Awesome. Congratulations, John.
Thank you. Thank you, Jay.
Excellent job.
Thank y'all for coming.
So I'm going to let John sneak out the door. There's a table right outside. If you got a book, you can get John to sign it. If you need to buy a book over at the Clinton Museum store, you can grab a book and come back to the table and get John to sign one or more copies. So thanks, John.
Thank y'all so much. Thank you, Jay.
Awesome. Good job.